Ruth Gardner's hands trembled as she stared at the gauge on the massive steel furnace. The numbers didn't match her calculations. She had added too much manganese, far too much, to the batch of helmet steel currently melting at over 2,000 degrees. Her supervisor would discover the mistake within hours, and in wartime Pennsylvania, errors like this could mean her job, maybe worse. But when the helmets were tested 3 weeks later, something impossible happened. Instead of shattering under the hammer, they flexed, absorbed the impact, and returned to shape. The military observers went silent. One colonel picked up a helmet, examined the dent that should have been a crack, and asked a single question that would echo through the war. Who made this batch? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The Fletcher Steelworks sat on the eastern edge of Pittsburgh like a fortress of smoke and fire, its 6 towering smokestacks visible from 10 miles away on a clear morning. Ruth Gardner had worked there for 8 months, ever since her husband Danny shipped out to North Africa with the 3rd Armored Division. The war had transformed the factory overnight, changing it from a producer of industrial equipment and railroad parts into a dedicated military supplier. Now, every shift meant helmet blanks, tank armor, and ammunition casings, all of it destined for young men like Danny, who were fighting in deserts and jungles half a world away. Ruth worked the graveyard shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Because the day rates went to men and the few remaining positions for women paid less unless you were willing to work when most people slept. The factory floor during night shift was a different world entirely, less supervised, more dangerous, and somehow more intimate despite the hundreds of workers scattered across the massive space. The daylight managers went home at 6, leaving the floor to shift supervisors who were spread too thin to monitor every station. Ruth had been assigned to the metallurgy mixing station 3 months earlier, after proving she could read technical specifications and follow the complex recipes that determined the properties of different steel batches. It was considered a step up from the pressing machines, where she had started, and it came with an extra 12 cents an hour. She took pride in the precision required, measuring out exact quantities of carbon, chromium, nickel, and manganese to create steel that met military specifications down to the 10th of a percentage point. The night everything changed started like any other. Ruth clocked in at 10:45, changed into her work coveralls in the women's locker room, which was really just a converted storage closet with 6 lockers and a cracked mirror, and made her way through the maze of machinery to her station. The mixing room was separated from the main floor by a brick wall and a heavy steel door, a safety measure because the furnaces inside reached temperatures that could melt flesh from bone in seconds. 3 other women worked the mixing stations during her shift: Dolores Kowalski, who had 2 sons in the Navy, Margaret Chen, whose family had moved to Pittsburgh from San Francisco after the internment orders, and Barbara Strickland, a former school teacher who never talked about why she had left her classroom job. They worked in a comfortable silence most nights, each focused on their own batches, occasionally sharing a thermos of coffee during the designated 15-minute break at 3 in the morning. Ruth had grown to appreciate the solitude of the work, the way it required complete attention but left her mind free to wander between the careful measurements. She thought about Danny constantly, replaying their last conversation at the train station, analyzing his letters for hidden meanings or signs of danger he might not be allowed to write explicitly. His most recent letter had arrived 5 days earlier. Postmarked from somewhere, the sensors had blacked out, mentioning heat and sand and a close call he couldn't describe in detail. The batch Ruth was preparing that night was designated for M1 helmet production, the new steel pot that had replaced the old tin hat design from the First War. The specifications called for a medium carbon steel with carefully controlled additions of manganese and silicon to provide hardness without brittleness. The recipe sat in front of her on a clipboard, numbers she had memorized after 3 months of mixing similar batches 5 nights a week. Base iron, 3.5% carbon, 1.8% manganese, 0.6% silicon, trace amounts of phosphorus and sulfur kept below 0.04% each. The manganese was critical because it strengthened the steel and helped it resist impact, but too much would make the metal unpredictable, potentially causing it to crack or behave inconsistently during the stamping process. Ruth measured out the components methodically, using the scale that she calibrated at the start of every shift. The manganese came in gray-black chunks that looked like rough coal stored in barrels near the furnace. She was supposed to add 42 pounds to this particular batch, enough to bring the final percentage to 1.8 after everything melted and mixed. She scooped the chunks into the large measuring bucket, watching the scale's needle climb. 40 pounds, 41, 42. She stopped, marked her checklist, and prepared to pour the manganese into the furnace's loading hopper. That was when the air raid siren went off. The sound ripped through the factory like a living thing, a rising and falling wail that made every person on the floor freeze for a half second before training took over. Ruth dropped the bucket, manganese chunks scattering across the floor as she turned toward the exit routes marked in yellow paint on the walls. The sirens had gone off twice before during her time at Fletcher, both false alarms, but nobody took chances anymore. Not after the stories from London, not after Pearl Harbor. The mixing room's emergency lights kicked on, bathing everything in red that made the shadows jump and twist. Dolores was already at the door, holding it open and shouting for everyone to move. Margaret grabbed Ruth's arm, and they ran together. Joining the stream of workers flowing toward the designated shelter areas in the factory's basement, the sirens kept screaming, joined now by the plant's own alarm system and the shouts of supervisors trying to maintain order. Ruth's heart hammered as they descended the stairs, crowding into the concrete-reinforced space that smelled of oil and damp earth. 300 people packed in, sitting on the floor, standing against walls, waiting in the red emergency lighting for the all-clear or the sound of bombs. The all-clear came 26 minutes later. A false alarm, someone announced, probably a weather balloon or a navigation error. Everyone filed back upstairs, returning to stations and trying to pick up the rhythm of work that had been shattered by adrenaline and fear. Ruth reached the mixing room to find the floor covered in manganese chunks, scattered when she had dropped the bucket. She swore under her breath and grabbed a broom, sweeping them into a pile. Some had rolled under equipment, others had mixed with the dirt and grit that accumulated despite daily cleaning. She gathered what she could see, dumped it back in the bucket, and checked the scale. It read 34 pounds. 8 pounds had scattered too far, rolled into corners or fallen through gaps in the flooring. Ruth looked at the clock, 2:47 in the morning. Her batch was already behind schedule because of the alarm, and the supervisor would be making his rounds within the hour. The furnace was at temperature, waiting for the final components. She had already added the carbon and silicon. The base iron was melting. All it needed was the manganese to complete the mix. She should have stopped right there. The correct procedure was to shut down the furnace, wait for the batch to cool, start over with proper measurements. But starting over would put her hours behind, would raise questions about why she wasted an entire batch, would mark her as unreliable in a factory where women were already fighting to prove they belonged. Ruth made a decision that would haunt her dreams for weeks afterward. She grabbed the manganese barrel, scooped out enough to bring the bucket back to 42 pounds, and dumped it all into the hopper. Except she forgot that she had already added 34 pounds. Her tired brain, rattled by the sirens and the rush of fear, registered the bucket's weight and not the fact that this was replacement material. She had just added 76 pounds of manganese to a batch that called for 42. The percentage would be wrong, dramatically wrong, somewhere around 3.2 or 3.3% instead of 1.8. The steel would be unpredictable, potentially useless, definitely out of specification. Ruth didn't realize the mistake until the next night when she was reviewing her notes at home, unable to sleep after her shift. She sat at the kitchen table, Danny's latest letter propped against the sugar bowl, and went through her checklist entry by entry. When she reached the manganese measurement, her stomach dropped. The scattered chunks, the refilled bucket, the hopper loading. She had doubled the critical ingredient in a batch of helmet steel, currently somewhere in the production pipeline. Probably already pressed into helmet blanks, waiting for inspection. She couldn't eat breakfast. She couldn't focus on the radio program her neighbor had knocked on the door to discuss. Something about ration coupons and a community meeting. All she could think about was the mistake, the batch number she had marked on her sheet. Batch number 4782. Those helmets would fail inspection, obviously. The metallurgy tests would show the composition was wrong. But would they trace it back to her? Would she lose her job? Worse, would she face charges for sabotage or negligence during wartime? People had been arrested for less. The factory had armed guards at the gates now. and everyone who worked there had been fingerprinted and photographed. She went to work that night, planning to confess, to find her supervisor, and explain the mistake before it went further. But when she arrived, the mixing room was in chaos. Two of the furnaces had been shut down for emergency maintenance, putting the entire night behind schedule. Her supervisor, a gruff man named Patterson who had worked at Fletcher for 30 years, was barking orders and checking clipboards while three-day managers who had stayed late argued over production priorities. Ruth waited for a chance to speak to him, but he waved her away impatiently, telling her to focus on the new batches assigned for tonight and stop bothering him with questions. She worked her shift in a haze of anxiety, measuring and mixing automatically while her mind spun through scenarios. Maybe the batch would just be scrapped quietly. Maybe they processed so many batches that one error would slip through without investigation. Maybe the war effort was so desperate for helmets that they would let minor variations pass as long as the steel held together. She went home at dawn and slept fitfully, dreaming of explosions and Danny's face. 3 weeks passed. Ruth heard nothing about Batch 4782. She watched the inspection reports posted on the bulletin board near the time clocks, looking for rejection notices or quality alerts, but saw nothing unusual. The factory produced thousands of helmet blanks every week, feeding them into a supply chain that stretched across the country to military bases and ports and eventually to soldiers overseas. Her mistake had vanished into the vast system, swallowed up and presumably dealt with quietly. She started to relax, to believe she had dodged catastrophe. The mixing work became routine again, the measurements precise. Her focus returned. She even began to take small pride in her consistency, earning a nod of approval from Patterson. When her batches came in at exactly specification, 5 nights in a row. Danny's letters continued to arrive sporadically, each one a gift she read a dozen times before carefully folding and adding to the box under her bed. He wrote about the stars in the desert, about the friends he had made in his unit, about missing her pierogies and the way rain sounded on their apartment's tin roof. Then, on a Tuesday morning in early April, Ruth clocked out to find 2 men in military uniforms waiting near the factory gates. One was a colonel with artillery insignia, the other a lieutenant with a briefcase. Patterson was with them, looking uncomfortable. The colonel spotted Ruth as she walked toward the gate and called her name. Ruth Gardner? Her heart stopped. This was it. The arrest, the charges, the end of everything. She walked over on legs that felt like wooden posts, her mouth dry, her hands clenched inside her pockets. The colonel smiled, which confused her completely. "Miss Gardner, I'm Colonel Hendricks from the Ordnance Department. I need to ask you some questions about a batch of helmet steel you mixed in early March. Batch number 4782. Do you remember it?" Ruth nodded, unable to speak. The colonel's smile widened. "Miss Gardner, that batch of steel produced the finest helmet blanks we've tested in 2 years. We need you to tell us exactly what you did differently." Ruth stood in the parking lot as dawnlight crept over the smokestacks, trying to process what the colonel had just said. The finest helmet blanks. Not defective, not dangerous. The finest. She stammered something about following the standard recipe, not doing anything special, just mixing according to the specifications. Colonel Hendricks exchanged a glance with the lieutenant, who opened his briefcase and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in technical data. The testing results told an extraordinary story. The helmets pressed from batch 4782 had gone through standard ballistics testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where they subjected military equipment to every kind of abuse imaginable. The normal M1 helmet would stop pistol rounds and shrapnel at moderate distances, and could withstand a specific amount of blunt force impact before either cracking or transferring lethal force to the wearer's skull. It was a significant improvement over the old Brody helmet, but it still failed under extreme conditions. Soldiers hit with close-range rifle fire or struck by large debris often survived the initial impact, only to die from skull fractures caused by the helmet's inability to dissipate energy. The helmets from Ruth's batch performed differently. When struck with the same rifle rounds at the same distances, they didn't crack or shatter. Instead, they flexed, absorbing the impact and distributing the force across a wider area. The dents were dramatic, pressing in as much as an inch, but then the metal returned most of the way to its original shape. The testers had been so surprised they repeated the experiments with hammers, dropped weights, and simulated shrapnel. Every time, the helmets from batch 4782 outperformed standard production by a significant margin. The metallurgical analysis showed why. The manganese content was nearly double the specification, at 3.3% instead of 1.8%. This should have made the steel brittle and unpredictable, but something about the specific combination of ingredients and the heating cycle had created a microstructure that gave the steel unusual properties. The high manganese content, combined with the medium carbon levels and the rapid cooling during the pressing process, produced a steel that could undergo significant plastic deformation, bending, and flexing, without cracking or permanently losing its shape. The metallurgists had a term for it, work-hardening alloy that maintained ductility, but in practical terms, it meant a helmet that could save lives in situations where standard helmets failed. Colonel Hendricks wanted to know if Ruth could recreate the batch. Could she remember everything she did that night? Every measurement, every timing, every variable? Ruth felt the weight of the lie she would have to tell pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't explain it was an accident, that she had panicked during an air raid drill and doubled a critical ingredient by mistake. If they knew it was random chance, they might not trust the results. They might decide it was too unpredictable to implement. Or worse, they might decide she was incompetent and remove her from the mixing room entirely. So, Ruth did something she never imagined herself capable of. She lied to a colonel in the United States Army during wartime. She told him she had experimented with the manganese levels, trying a variation she had been thinking about for weeks, based on some readings she had done about alloy properties. She made it sound deliberate, careful, scientific. She pulled terms from the technical manuals she had studied when she first started mixing work, talking about grain structure and crystalline formation and stress distribution. The colonel ate it up, nodding and making notes, while the lieutenant wrote down everything she said. They asked her to mix another batch immediately under observation. Ruth agreed, her heart pounding, and led them back into the factory. Patterson was delighted to have military brass watching his operation, and he cleared Ruth's station for the demonstration. She went through the process exactly as she had that night, or as close as she could remember, except this time she deliberately added the higher manganese content, measuring it carefully to match the 3.3% the tests had shown. The colonel and lieutenant watched every move, asking questions about timing and temperature and mixing duration. The batch went into production, tagged as experimental run A-1 for tracking purposes. 3 weeks later, the results came back identical to the original batch 4782. The helmets flexed under impact, showed the same superior energy absorption, and demonstrated the same remarkable durability. Colonel Hendricks returned to the factory with new orders. The Ordnance Department wanted to shift all M1 helmet production to the modified specification immediately. Ruth's accidental discovery was about to become the new standard for American combat helmets. The implementation took months. Metallurgists at military labs worked to understand exactly why the high manganese content produced such dramatic improvements, eventually publishing classified papers that laid out the science behind work-hardening steel alloys. Engineers redesigned the pressing and cooling processes to optimize the properties of the new steel. Training programs taught factory workers across the country how to mix and handle the modified recipe. Through all of it, Ruth Gardner became something of a celebrity within the military-industrial complex. The factory girl who had improved on government specifications through clever experimentation. She hated every minute of the recognition. The War Department wanted to do a press release, photographs of Ruth at her mixing station for newspapers and newsreels, the woman helping win the war through American ingenuity. She refused, claiming she was too shy, that the attention would be uncomfortable, but really she feared that scrutiny might reveal the truth. Someone might dig into her work records, find the air raid drill timing, notice the inconsistency in her notes, ask the right questions that would make the whole story unravel. Patterson was disappointed. He had hoped the publicity would bring positive attention to Fletcher Steelworks, but he didn't push when Ruth stood firm. The modified helmet started reaching combat units in summer of 1943. Ruth listened to war news with a new kind of attention, trying to imagine her steel protecting men she would never meet in places she could barely pronounce. Danny's letters mentioned that their unit had received new gear, including helmets that looked the same but felt different, somehow sturdier. He didn't know his wife was responsible for the steel that might save his life. Ruth had decided not to tell him, not to tell anyone who didn't absolutely need to know, because the weight of the lie was already more than she could comfortably carry. The letters from the War Department started arriving in autumn. Brief official notifications, always marked confidential, detailing specific incidents where the modified helmets had protected soldiers from injuries that would have been fatal with standard gear. A corporal in Italy struck by falling masonry from a bombed building should have died from skull fracture, walked away with a concussion because his helmet absorbed and distributed the impact. A private in the Pacific hit by shrapnel from a Japanese grenade, standard helmet would have cracked and driven fragments into his head. The modified helmet dented but held, saving his life. A sergeant in France caught in an artillery barrage, took a glancing blow from debris that would have killed him with old equipment, survived because the steel flexed instead of shattering. Each letter included a paragraph thanking Ruth for her contribution to the war effort, her innovation that was saving American lives. The Army kept statistics on everything, and their analysis suggested that the modified helmet design was preventing approximately 30% more fatal head injuries compared to the original M1 specification. In a war where margins measured in percentage points could mean thousands of lives, Ruth's accidental discovery was making a measurable difference. She kept the letters in a locked box in her closet, taking them out sometimes in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep, reading them over and over while trying to reconcile the good they described with the lie that made it possible. The war had taught everyone about moral complexity, about good results from imperfect circumstances, but Ruth struggled with the disconnect between what people believed about her and what she knew to be true. She was a fraud who had panicked and made a mistake, not a clever innovator who had improved military technology through careful reasoning. Dolores noticed Ruth's mood darkening despite the recognition. They had grown closer over the months of working adjacent mixing stations, sharing coffee and conversation during breaks, trading stories about their men overseas. One night in December, during their 3 a.m. break, Dolores asked directly what was wrong. "You look like someone carrying the weight of the world," she said, "and this after the Army gave you a commendation and Patterson put your name on the honor board. You should be proud." Ruth almost told her. The words were right there, the whole story, the air raid siren and the scattered manganese and the doubled batch that should have been a disaster. But she swallowed them back because speaking the truth would mean facing consequences she couldn't control. Instead, she said she was worried about Danny, which was also true, and Dolores accepted the explanation with a sympathetic nod. Everyone at the factory worried about someone overseas. The war had made fear and anxiety as common as breathing. The real turning point came in March of 1944, when Ruth received a letter that wasn't from the War Department or from Danny. The return address was from a hospital in England, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Her hands shook as she opened it, standing in the apartment building's lobby where the mailboxes were mounted, afraid to wait until she got upstairs. The letter was from a soldier named Robert Kowalski, Dolores' older son, writing on behalf of several men in his unit who wanted to thank the woman responsible for the improved helmets. Robert wrote about a battle in France where his unit had come under heavy mortar fire. He described in careful detail how shrapnel and debris had rained down on their position for nearly an hour, how several men had been hit, how their helmets had saved them in ways the old equipment wouldn't have. He specifically mentioned a private named Marcus Green, whose helmet had been struck by a piece of metal traveling fast enough to have punched through standard steel. The modified helmet had stopped it, the impact driving Green to his knees and leaving a dent so deep the helmet had to be pried off his head afterward. But he was alive and writing letters home to his daughter in Alabama. Robert included a small photograph, creased and smudged, showing a group of soldiers holding up their dented helmets like trophies. Some of the dents were massive, pressing the steel in at angles that looked impossible. The men were grinning, alive, grateful for equipment that had kept them that way. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Thank you, Ruth Gardner, from the guys who get to go home." Robert's letter ended with a simple statement that hit Ruth harder than any official commendation. "My mother tells me you work beside her every night. I'm glad someone like you is helping take care of soldiers like us. You're saving lives, and that matters more than anything." Ruth sat on the stairs in her building's lobby, still holding the letter and photograph, and cried for the first time since Danny had left for the war. The tears weren't from sadness or fear, but from a release of pressure she hadn't realized was crushing her. These men were alive because of her mistake, because she had panicked and doubled an ingredient and been too proud to admit the error. The lie she carried felt different suddenly, less like a burden and more like a strange kind of grace. Maybe the truth of how something happened mattered less than the fact that it had happened at all. She showed the letter to Dolores the next night at work, wordlessly handing it over during their break. Dolores read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she worked through her son's handwriting, then pulled Ruth into a fierce hug that smelled of machine oil and coffee. "That's my boy," Dolores said, her voice thick with emotion. "And that's you, doing something that matters." Ruth hugged her back and decided in that moment to let go of the guilt she had been carrying. The lie would remain, the truth would stay locked inside her, but she would stop torturing herself over the gap between them. The war continued its grinding momentum through 1944 and into 1945. Ruth mixed batch after batch of the modified helmet steel, training new workers on the specifications that had become standard across the military supply chain. She received more letters from soldiers, some sent directly and others forwarded through military channels, each one describing a moment where the improved helmet had made the difference between life and death. She kept them all, filling 3 boxes with photographs and notes and small tokens of gratitude that men had sent from battlefields around the world. Danny came home in November of 1945, 3 months after the Japanese surrender. He was thinner than she remembered, quieter, carrying weight in his eyes that hadn't been there when he left. They adjusted to each other slowly, relearning how to share space and conversation after 3 years of nothing but letters. He showed her his helmet one evening, the dented steel pot he had carried through North Africa and Sicily and up through Italy. The dent was on the left side, deep and ragged, from an incident he described vaguely as a close call near Anzio. He didn't know Ruth had made the steel that had saved him until she finally told him 6 months after his return. They were sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, and Ruth just said it quietly without preamble. "I made the steel in your helmet, the new specification that the Army used. That was me." Danny looked up from the sports section, confused at first, then understanding slowly spreading across his face. He got up, retrieved the helmet from the closet where he had stored it, along with the rest of his gear, and set it on the table between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Danny traced the dent with his fingers, following the deep crease where metal had compressed under impact. Finally, he asked how she had figured it out, how she had known to change the specifications in a way that military engineers hadn't considered. Ruth took a breath, standing at the edge of truth and lies, and made a decision. She told him the real story, all of it, the air raid siren and the panic and the scattered manganese and the doubling of the batch. She told him about the fear and the lie to the colonel and the weight of recognition for an accident. She told him everything she had held inside for 3 years. Danny listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Ruth finished, bracing for disappointment or anger, he picked up the helmet and turned it in his hands, examining the dent from different angles. Then he said something Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. "Doesn't matter how it happened, matters that it did. I'm sitting here drinking coffee with my wife because you made that steel, accident or not. Marcus Green gets to watch his daughter grow up. Robert Kowalski made it home to his mother. You want to carry guilt about a lie? Fine. But I'm going to be grateful for a mistake that saved my life." The simplicity of his perspective cut through years of Ruth's internal struggle. She had been so focused on the dishonesty of claiming credit for an accident that she had missed the larger truth Danny saw clearly. Intent mattered less than outcome when the outcome was measured in lives preserved. She had lied to protect herself, yes, but that lie had allowed a genuine improvement to become standard equipment faster than it might have otherwise. If she had confessed the error immediately, the military might have dismissed it as a fluke, too unreliable to implement. Her false claim of deliberate experimentation had given them confidence to adopt the modification across the entire army. Ruth never publicly corrected the record. The official history of the improved M1 helmet credited her with innovative metallurgical work that enhanced soldier protection during World War II. Technical journals and military histories described her methodical approach to alloy modification. When the Army interviewed her years later for an oral history project documenting war production innovations, she repeated the story of deliberate experimentation, keeping the accident locked away. Only Danny knew the truth, and he took it to his grave when he died in 1987, never having told another soul. Ruth lived to see the modified helmet design influence military equipment for decades. The principles of high manganese steel and work-hardening alloys became standard in armor development, applied to everything from tank hulls to personnel carriers. Metallurgists built on the specifications she had accidentally discovered, creating entire families of advanced materials. She attended a ceremony in 1992 where the Army recognized her contribution to military technology 50 years after the original batch 4782. She was 81 years old, her hands shaking slightly as she accepted a plaque commemorating her work. During the reception afterward, a young engineer approached her with questions about her research process in the 1940s. How had she known to try the higher manganese content? What had led her to that specific percentage? What testing had she done before submitting the batch? Ruth looked at this earnest young man, educated in metallurgy at MIT, employed by a defense contractor to develop the next generation of protective materials. And she made a decision. She told him the truth. She explained the air raid siren and the scattered manganese and the panic that had led her to double an ingredient by mistake. She described the fear when she realized what she had done, and the lie she told to cover her error. She laid out the whole story in flat, factual detail, without embellishment or justification. The young engineer listened with growing surprise, his expression shifting from reverence to confusion to something like wonder. When Ruth finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he started to laugh. It wasn't mocking laughter, but the delighted sound of someone encountering a truth that upended assumptions. "You're telling me," he said, "that one of the most significant advances in military armor in the 20th century came from a factory worker panicking during an air raid drill?" Ruth nodded. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The engineer shook his head, still grinning. "That's the most honest thing I've heard about innovation in my entire career. Half of material science is accidents we figure out how to reproduce on purpose." His response gave Ruth a sense of peace she hadn't expected to find. The engineer went on to explain that many major discoveries in metallurgy and chemistry had similar origins, mistakes, or coincidences that led to unexpected properties. Vulcanized rubber, safety glass, stainless steel, all of them had stories of accidents and errors that turned into breakthroughs. Ruth's experience wasn't unique in that sense. What made it remarkable was that she had recognized the potential of her mistake, even if accidentally, and had found a way to make it reproducible. Intent mattered less than observation and adaptation. Ruth gave a few more interviews in her final years, and in most of them, she told the true story. Some historians were surprised, others were skeptical. A few were delighted by the human reality behind the technical achievement. The official records never changed. Her name remained associated with innovative metallurgical work, and the technical specifications carried forward based on her modified recipe. But Ruth had made her peace with the complexity of her legacy. She had lied to protect herself, and that lie had helped save thousands of lives. She had made a mistake under pressure, and that mistake had led to genuine improvement in military protection. Both things were true, and the tension between them didn't need to be resolved. She died in 1998 at the age of 87 in the same Pittsburgh neighborhood where she had lived since the war. Her obituary in the local paper mentioned her work at Fletcher Steelworks and her contribution to helmet design, calling her a pioneer among women in military manufacturing. Dolores's daughter attended the funeral, bringing a photograph of Robert Kowalski in his Army uniform, standing with the men whose helmets had saved their lives. The photograph was placed in Ruth's casket, a reminder of the human cost and benefit of her accidental discovery. The technical legacy of Batch 4782 extended far beyond Ruth's lifetime. Modern military helmets still use principles of high manganese steel and work-hardening alloys, refined and improved through decades of research, but rooted in the specifications Ruth had stumbled into during a moment of panic. Thousands of soldiers over multiple conflicts owed their lives to equipment derived from her mistake, though most of them never knew the name of the woman who had mixed the steel or the circumstances that had led to its unique properties. In the archive at Aberdeen Proving Ground, researchers can still find the original test reports from April 1943, documenting the unusual properties of helmet batch 4782. The reports note the superior performance compared to standard specifications and recommend immediate adoption of the modified formula. They credit the innovation to experimentation by mixing roomworker Ruth Gardner at Fletcher Steelworks in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The truth behind those reports, the air raid siren, and the scattered manganese, and the panicked doubling of a critical ingredient, exists only in a handful of oral history recordings Ruth gave near the end of her life. The disconnect between official history and messy reality is common in wartime production, where thousands of men and women made decisions under pressure that shaped outcomes in ways they couldn't fully predict or control. Ruth's story is unusual only in that the truth eventually emerged, filtered through her own willingness to complicate her legacy with honesty. Most such stories remain buried, their complexities lost as people die, and memories fade, and official records replace lived experience. What remains indisputable is the measurable impact of the modified helmet design. Military historians estimate that the improved M1 helmet specification, derived from Ruth's accidental high manganese batch, prevented between 8,000 and 12,000 fatal head injuries during World War II alone. That number doesn't account for subsequent conflicts where the same principles protected soldiers, or the civilian applications of work-hardening steel that grew from military research. The ripple effects of one mistake during one night shift in one factory in Pennsylvania touched millions of lives across decades. Ruth would have resisted that kind of grandiose framing. She thought of herself as someone who got lucky, who made an error that happened to produce useful results, nothing more. But luck requires context to become meaningful. Ruth's mistake mattered because she was working in a system desperate for improvements, because she had learned enough metallurgy to replicate the error deliberately, because she lied well enough to make officials take the results seriously, and because she carried the weight of that lie long enough for the benefits to become undeniable. Strip away any one of those elements, and the story has a different ending. The helmet sitting in the Smithsonian's Military History Collection, marked as an example of improved M1 design from 1943, doesn't reveal any of this complexity. It sits behind glass labeled with Ruth Gardner's name and a description of her innovative metallurgical work. Visitors walk past it every day without knowing about air raid sirens or scattered manganese or the lie that made the truth possible. The helmet is just steel and paint and history, silent about the panic and accident and human fallibility that shaped it into something that saved lives. Maybe that's appropriate. The machinery of war and production and historical memory tends to smooth away the rough edges of individual experience, creating clean narratives from messy reality. Ruth Gardner improved military helmet design through innovative metallurgy becomes the official story. While Ruth Gardner panicked during an air raid drill and accidentally doubled, the manganese content remains a footnote in oral history archives. Both stories are true. Neither is complete without the other. The gap between them holds the real truth about how progress happens, how accidents become innovations, and how one person's mistake can ripple through history in ways no one could predict or plan. The factory where Ruth worked is gone now, demolished in the 1970s when Pittsburgh's steel industry collapsed. The building's location is marked by a parking lot and a small plaque noting the site's historical significance as a military production facility during World War II. Ruth's name isn't on the plaque. Most of the women who worked alongside her through the war years are forgotten by history, their contributions absorbed into the larger narrative of American industrial might without individual recognition or memory. But the steel they mixed still exists in museums and private collections. In the helmets veterans kept as souvenirs and the equipment preserved as artifacts of military history. Somewhere in those dented shells of metal is the physical legacy of Ruth Gardner's mistake, the atoms of manganese she added by accident in proportions that changed the properties of steel in ways that saved lives. The material doesn't care about intent or lies or the complexity of human motivation. It simply is what it is, shaped by circumstance into something more useful than anyone planned. That, finally, is what Ruth came to understand in her last years. The value of her contribution didn't depend on the purity of her motives or the intentionality of her discovery. It existed in the gap between what she meant to do and what actually happened, in the space where accident becomes opportunity and mistake becomes innovation. She made steel that saved soldiers. Everything else, the fear and the lie and the guilt, was just the human cost of living with consequences she never intended to create. The army got better helmets. The soldiers got better protection. Ruth got a complicated legacy that mixed truth and lies in proportions as carefully balanced as any metallurgical formula. And, in the end, that strange alloy of accident and intent produced something stronger than anyone could have designed on purpose.